Welcome. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to RELASK Common Forum and Minamata Convention webinar on managing mercury contaminated soils and sites. And since it has been, I have announced that this will be recorded. I will to start recording if you haven't done so yet. Um, So, I think I will share my screen, which is the uh, program. So, uh, as you see in this program, the RELASK Common Forum, the regulator networks for contaminated land management in Latin America and Europe, and also the Minamata Convention Secretariat are organizing this bilingual webinar in English and French, in English and Spanish. You can select the language by clicking the tab on the bottom right of your screen. And this bilingual webinar is convened with the financial support from the government of Switzerland. Uh, the presentation materials and recordings will be made available on the convention website. Uh, First, um, I would like to provide the opening remark on behalf of the Secretariat of the Minamata Convention, followed by the Federal Office of the Environment, Switzerland, and Common Forum on Contaminated Land. The first session is about case studies, and we asked the uh, Canton of Valais of Switzerland to uh, present on their experience in the management of contaminated land, and also from Mexico, the holistic health risk assessment in artisanal mercury mining region in Mexico. The session two will be on remediation, moderated by Christiane, and presentations will be from TAUW on the managed remediation of chloralkali site, and also from BRGM France. So this is the program for today. Before going into the presentations, I would like to present a bit of background of the Minamata Convention. As most of you may know, the Minamata Convention is a global treaty to protect the human health and the environment from mercury, and it entered into force 5 years ago, and it addresses the whole life cycle of mercury, including contaminated sites. The Article 12 of contaminated sites provides that each party shall endeavor to develop appropriate strategies for identifying and assessing sites contaminated with mercury and mercury compounds. And it also requests the conference of the parties to adopt guidance on managing contaminated sites. Uh, that guidance was adopted at COP3 3 years ago, and in its decision, the COP, uh, uh, of course, adopted the guidance as you see on the right-hand side. This is a schematic chart of the management of the contaminated site. I'm not going into technical details, but the COP decision noted the importance of capacity building and encouraged the parties to take the guidance into account in managing contaminated sites, and also requested the Secretariat to continue to collect technical information and make such information available to parties. And this webinar is part of that effort. Uh, uh, the COP decision also notes that the guidance should be revised in the future in view of uh, uh, the the newest technical information. So, with this, I am handing over to Christiane to represent the other um, co-organizer.
Thank you, Eisaku. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on mercury, polluted sites and soil. I'm Christiane Vermeil, head of the contaminated sites section at the Federal Office for the Environment in Switzerland. The contaminated sites section harmonizes and assists the cantons in their task of identification, investigation, monitoring, and remediation of contaminated sites. It also supports them financially. The Federal Office for the Environment wishes to promote the exchange of experience and best practice in order to facilitate the remediation of mercury polluted sites. To this end, it planned to hold a meeting with representatives from Latin American and European countries in Switzerland in April 2020. Unfortunately, the COVID pandemic moved faster and made this meeting impossible. After various discussions, it became clear that only online webinars would allow the participation of a larger number of countries. It is therefore a great pleasure to be able to put this idea into practice today with the first virtual meeting. I would like to thank Dietmar Müller-Graber, Eisaku Toda, and Pedro Cifuentes Ames for the very pleasant discussions and their efforts in putting together today's program. And I would also like to thank the speakers for their availability to share their experiences with us, and finally, all the participants for your presence today. I hope that interesting discussions will take place after the presentations. I give the floor to Dietmar.
I don't see him in the list. Is he there? Perhaps there is a technical problem with Dietmar. So I think we can invite him to provide a closing remark. And see while we see Pedro on the screen, he represents Relax, and he will provide the closing remarks. So on for the benefit of the time, um, and I don't see Dietmar.
I
Yeah,
see it. Yeah.
You see, okay,
okay.
Dietmar.
So sorry. So it's Murphy's Law that everything fails. No, but I'm back and I'm happy to be with you. Happy to see you all and finally come together for this webinar. So I'm Dietmar Müller-Grabe, representing Common Forum on Contaminated Land in Europe, which is a regulators and technical advisors network of European countries. It's in the heart of our mission that we want to organize knowledge and experience exchange, and in particular as well the cooperation with international organizations and networks. So many thanks to the UN Secretariat and to Relask for keeping the positive mood to come forward with the webinar and to restart on international cooperation. It is nowadays the One Health approach taking the stage, which means a healthy planet involving health of environment, humans, animal, plants. It's integrative. Herein, Mercury is one of our still global challenges. That's what we try to address to this webinar and hopefully in future. I close with my personal thanks for the Secretariat, for Relask, and as well for the Federal Office of Environment in Switzerland. I think Austria and Switzerland, we are strong alpine connection like the Relask along the Andes. So thank you so much and have an interesting and successful webinar. Back to you, Isako.
Thank you, Dietmar. We are just on time. 10 past 3 is to start the session 1. which is about the case studies. As I explained in my opening remark, the Conference of the Parties of the Minamata Convention uh, adopted the guidance on the management of contaminated sites and request the Secretariat to collect more information, technical information, practical information to assist parties in managing the contaminated sites. And the case studies, best practice, these are the most important information that could be shared among parties who are struggling to manage the contaminated sites to protecting the human health and the environment. So in this session, first session, as I said, we invited two organizations, one of which is represented by two speakers. The first is the Canton of Valais, which has a very good uh, experience in managing the site contaminated in mercury in the territory. And the second is from the case study from Mexico. So I would now hand over to Chantal Imhoff and Stefan Westermann to present the cases in in the Valley, in Valley. And perhaps you can share your screen, or if it doesn't work, I can share it from my end. But can you uh, present? Yes, I see it. So back to over to you.
Hi, hi everyone. I hope you all seen the screen now.
Yes.
Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. We're gonna now talk for the next 20 minutes about a case study in Switzerland with a case of polluted soil in an alpine floodplain. My colleague Chantal and I will share the presentation. Okay. So just a few words about what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to shortly present the Swiss legislation, then present you a historical background, show you what kind of analysis we did and the results we obtained, and then the remediation projects in the urban zone, the agricultural zone, and how we manage the residual pollution. So, just a few words about the Swiss legislation. So, the contaminated, in Switzerland, the contaminated sites are regulated by the Contaminated Sites Ordinance, CSO. It gives us the legal framework to handle polluted and contaminated sites, and it specifies how a polluted site has to be assessed, namely how the polluted site affect the four protected resources: the soil, the groundwater, the water surface, and the air, and how we classify the contaminated sites in function of their impact on the environment. So we have sites that need monitoring, that need remediation, or that need neither monitoring or remediation. And the CSO also specifies the responsibility at each step. So this is just a schematic scheme of the how the different steps of the contaminated of the CSO. So basically, the step one is the authority, in general, the canton. They establish a list of contaminated site, and then the polluter can do some opposition. After that, in step 2 and 3, the canton asks for investigation, which are conducted by the polluter. And based on the results, the authority then decides what has to be done. What are the objectives? If there is any emergency of doing some remediation and so on. Afterwards, the polluter has to establish a remediation project, which must be validated by the authority, and after that, the polluter can start the remediation project. A few words for those who don't really know Switzerland. So Switzerland is located in the center of Western Europe. It's a small country of with about 8.5 million inhabitants and a surface area of about 42,000 square kilometers. The Alps regions are mainly located in the south part, and we're going to focus on the canton of Valais, more specifically in that small area from the Oberwallis. And in this region, you have a town, Visp, and a small village, Raron. And basically, 1/3 of the city of Visp is occupied by a chemical plant, and this is shown here in red. And in orange, you have a drainage channel, which is about 9 kilometers long, and it goes here, shown in orange. And basically, in the 30s, between the 30s and the late 70s, great amount of mercury was used on the chemical side in various chemical processes, production processes, and due to the industrial release into the drainage canal, the sediments of the canal itself accumulated mercury. Beside this accumulation, between the 30s to the 90s, through diverse maintenance works in the channel itself, the contaminated sediments spread around the surrounding lands and further away, as mainly as backfills. We also have in this case study evidences for material that were directly excavated from the industrial side into private backfields. And in 2010, the pollution was discovered in the soil during the building of a motorway in the region. Just a few words about the method. So the main focus here was on the soil, and we did our investigation using composite samples that were homogenized and sieved in a cool room, dried for 2 days at 40 degrees, and digested in 2 nitric acid. We did some speciation tests to see what kind of mercury we have in our soils, and basically the results showed that there was no elementary mercury in the soil. Most of the mercury in our case appears to be present as a matrix-bound divalent mercury, Hg2+. We performed as well groundwater monitoring, so we do 2 campaigns per year using about 12 piezometers that are situated along the channel. And of course, because the perimeter is quite large, we had to prioritize our investigation. And the first focus was on the urban zones, so in Visp and Raron. And even within the urban zones, we did the investigation using sectors. And this is just to show you a bit how many sectors we have in that perimeter. So the main focus, as I said, was in the urban zones here and here. And then we did investigation within the agricultural zone, and a third priority was the channel itself. Again, a few words about the results. So between 2013 and 2022, we did more than 11,000 soil analyses within the region, which is shown here on the map. We found in the urban areas more than 130 private lots that with a need of remediation. Within the agricultural zone, we detected more than 20 hotspots. And as I said, the channel, the third priority is still, the investigation are still ongoing. And to give you a bit an idea of how much material that need to be excavated, so the 130 private lots plus the 200 hotspots, the 20 hotspots, sorry, represents more than 30,000 cubic meters of soil that has to be excavated. And what we, for the moment, what we have is in the groundwater and the air sampling, we didn't find any relevant concentration. One of the main problem for us was the high heterogeneity of the pollution distribution, and this slide shows you just how the lots were classified after two series of sampling. On the left side, you have the first sampling. We did one sample per lot. That gave us a contamination value, and afterwards we came back and analyzed the rest of the surface. And basically, what we see is that we have really a very high heterogeneity of the pollution distribution at various scale levels. Another problem was the management of the pollution, because basically from the moment on where we have polluted soil, the canton is entered the lot into a register, and this is a great problem for the property. And now I'm gonna talk about the remediation. So as for the investigation, the remediation, we did a prioritization in the remediation projects. We started with the urban zone, then the agricultural area, and as a third priority, the channel itself. So for the urban area, one first thing is which soil has to be remediated. And basically, in Switzerland, the limit for polluted soil is given by the concentration of 0.5 milligram mercury per kilogram soil. From that limit, we have to do a risk assessment. And in the urban zone, when we have values up 2 milligram mercury per kilogram soil, there is a need of remediation. And one thing is that the legal requirement for the from the CSO is basically to guarantee after remediation that there is no hazard for man and the environment. That means everything that is polluted with more than 2 milligram per kilogram has to be removed, and basically you will have a rest pollution for the slightly polluted soil. And that's different from the expectation of the owners, because basically what they want is they want to have no pollution in the soil at all. The state of progress for the urban areas. In 2016, we did 2 pilot projects, one in each city. In 2017, the authorization to carry out the remediation work was obtained, and the start of the remediation was in November 2017. And actually, 95% of the work is done in the urban areas. I'm now handing over to Chantal for the rest. Oh no! Before that, just a few pictures of what effort has to be done when you do some remediation work. So basically, it's big machine working in your garden. Sometimes when you have valuable trees, you have to do really precise work, handworks. And when we excavate, we basically we excavate strats that are also 20 centimeter strats to be sure that we removed every pollution. And after that, we did some controls. And sometimes we also had bad surprises with by the restoration when the material was not really adequate for the restoration. I'm now handing over to Chantal for the rest of the presentation.
Hola, muy buenos días.
Good morning. I'm going to speak in Spanish. Now, first, I'd like to talk about the agricultural area. As Stefan already explained, it's from 0.5 parts per million of mercury that the soil is considered to be contaminated. For agricultural areas, the limit area is 20 parts per million for remediation, and apart from 20 parts per million, no use can be made of this. And so unless remediation is made, the area cannot be used beyond that amount, 20 milligrams. Now there's 0.5 ppm and the 20 ppm, where we have to do a risk analysis, and use restrictions are imposed if necessary. So to perform the risk assessment, a number of studies need to be performed. The first is to look at the concentration of mercury in plants to see how the mercury is going from the soil to the plants. And in this case, we found very little mercury. Then there's a second study, which looks at the concentration of mercury in meat. In the contaminated area, there are cows and sheep above all. And it's with sheep where we see the most problems because they ingest a lot of the soil as they eat grass. And the test revealed a very small amount of mercury, however. Then we created a model to explain these low values, and it's because of the dilution effect. These sheep tend to spend 2 or 3 months in the contaminated area, but in the rest of the year, they're in the mountains, as you can see in the photo here. And in the winter, they are indoors. And then for animal feed, there wasn't much of a problem. We complied with legal standards. And we did another study on the production of fodder. The problem here is that the soil is right next to the fodder, and so that we see that there is a risk of going above the maximum limit for fodder, which is 0.114 milligrams of mercury per kilo of dry matter, with concentrations of mercury of more than 8.5 ppm in the ground. The study showed that there was a risk of when the 8.5 ppm was exceeded, and that there was a risk of exceeding that amount. And so the canton wanted to avoid this. They didn't want to restrict use, because then if they did make restrictions, they would have to control the use, and they didn't have the necessary resources to do so. In the end, we reached an agreement with the chemical company to pursue this from 7 ppm, because there's a certain amount of uncertainty in the model. We could pursue, but we agreed to pursue remediation from 7 milligrams. And after remediation, we see the areas of more than 7 ppm. and they were able to continue without any restrictions. So we reached an agreement with the polluting company in 2021 in the summer. Then there were two pilot projects at the end of 2021. And then in 2022, the remediation process was halted because it wasn't very clear if the soil was clean enough, because it had concentrations of PFAS. And we didn't yet have the maximum values for the PFAS. And so the canton proposed a limit for this, for the PFAS, and that was then validated by the ministry in the summer. And we are now able to continue with this remediation process, and the work should be completed between 2023 and 2027. Here you can see some photos of the pilot projects. On the top left, you can see how there are rubber sheets that are used to avoid compacting the ground with the weight of the lorries, because these boards support the weight. And then here there's another pilot project where they're working during the winter when the ground is frozen. And in that case, there isn't this risk of compacting the earth, and they don't need to use these rubber sheets. But in future, we think we might want to use these rubber sheets in the winter as well, but rather so that then we don't depend on the temperature and the weather. Here in the bottom left, we can see the soil that's been cleaned and it is compacted. And in the bottom right, this is after remediation. Now, we've already talked about the residential area and the agricultural area. And finally, I'd like to talk about the canal. This is the canal, which is at the origin of all of the polluting mercury. There are very high concentrations of mercury in a lot of the canal. The total amount is 2.7 tons of mercury in the canal. Now, if the banks are eroded, then it will enter the sediment, and that would be very dangerous for the fauna and the food chain in the area. The mercury can also reach the Rodano River and Lake Leman, which is downstream. And it's estimated that 40 grams of mercury per day reach the Lake Leman. In 2023, we're going to perform a risk assessment on the canal. Now, of course, where waste is very important here, the concentrations of mercury are relatively low, 0.5 to 5 ppm. And the soil that was polluted ends up in the landfill. Now, if there's more than 5 ppm of mercury, a heat treatment is required either in Switzerland or abroad. In order to have enough material to refill these lands, we created a soil deposit. And here you can see the difference between the upper layer and the lower layer of the soil. Now I'm going to talk about the long-term pollution management. So, after remediation, the cadastral entry is removed, and they also have to enter this into the SIG database of the canton. The remediation we spoke of before was just done in areas where there was a high probability of pollution. These yellow areas you can see on the map here. But this pollution could reach other areas. And that's why we created this blue perimeter. And whenever there's a construction project within this perimeter and soil and land is moved, then we have to assess the mercury levels in the soil, and then we have to remove the soil if necessary in the appropriate manner. So now I'm coming to the end of the presentation, and I'll present a number of conclusions. Swiss regulations on contaminated sites is a firm legal basis for eliminating dangerous pollution created by the polluter. It can easily be applied to industrial areas that are properly limited. For non-standard cases, in other words, when there's pollution in residential areas, there are a number of consequences. Well, it has to be commented in the cadastral entry. Obviously, the owners don't like that because their property then can lose value. It's also important to understand that remediation doesn't mean a complete removal of the contaminants. There's always some residual pollution. The remediation work require a large amounts of clean soil in order to substitute the surface that has been remediated. It's difficult to find these clean soils, so it's very important that soils are assessed whenever there is any construction project. Thank you very much for listening.
For your very interesting presentation, and your one of the conclusions were very impressive. The importance of the
You're welcome.
firm legislation uh, to make polluters pay, and the setting up the limit value and thresholds and risk assessment procedures that are quite challenging in developing countries. But I think this is something we can discuss in the discussion session. Thank you very much, and to the participants, please, if you have any question, please use the chat box. With this, I think I will then uh, turn to the next speaker uh, about your or, uh, uh, experience in Mexico. So, Fernando, floor is yours. I think you can share your screen.
You see my screen now?
Yes, I see it now. Yes.
Okay. As requested, I'm going to give my presentation in Spanish. Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It is indeed very important for me to bring in the results of that work. We will be talking about the risk assessment, but having a holistic perspective. Minamata Convention, as already mentioned, is extremely important because it searches not only to improve human health, but also the health of the whole environment. It is thanks to Minamata that for the first time in mankind history, we will have the control on one of the most serious toxic elements that have affected mankind for so long. In Mexico, mercury has been used for 21 centuries, especially in rituals. Our country is a big mercury producer, taking up important spots at world level, often second or perhaps third. But it's still a very strong mercury producer. Thanks to Minamata Convention, though, slowly and gradually that production has been phased off. And in 19, we produced 200 tons, but by 2021, the production is at 40 tons. Naturally, it all depends on the market, and we often produce more, sometimes less. But the thing is that the mercury produced in Mexico, all of it comes from small mining operations. Now, what are these artisanal mining operations about? Here we see an air picture of one of the largest mercury mines in the region. Now, we're talking about underground mines, and the miners go down and they search on the walls for evidences of cinnabar. They scratch the surface and then they grind it, looking for a cinnabar. Now, what is done with these rocks? They are afterwards introduced into these steel tubes and they are then heated. And this is the uh, same system that has been used for centuries. In this procedure, this is heated so that the metallic mercury, the elemental mercury, get the gases cooled off in these tubes. Here we see the furnace. This is the cooling process. After the vapor is cooled, mercury is obtained. Since this is a small traditional system that is hard as it is for human health, we decided to check what was the exposure to humans. We first conducted a study with the miners. The first part of the risk assessment is the environmental monitoring. You can see how the vapors from the furnaces go out into the air. And if you realize that the mercury is volatile, this is indeed quite a risk. Indeed, in 59 samples collected in one of these mines, about third, one third, as I was saying, of these samples had mercury levels above the permitted limits. We then went to take a look at the soil. We collected soil samples from the mines, and what we found was terrifying. All of the samples way above the limits that in Mexico are of 23 milligrams per kilo. They were much higher than what we saw for Switzerland. 23 milligrams. All samples showed high levels, and we're talking about some that even got to 16,000. So the site is fully contaminated by mercury. Having in mind the fact that the miners are exposed to this, you can see in the picture how they are exposed to the vapors and to the contaminated soil. So it was expected that they would also have a high urine mercury content. Indeed, all of the miners studied here showed values above permitted. The miners are well exposed to mercury contamination, and we then wanted to see what were the effects on their health. And we did find neurological signs in miners, such as handshaking. We also saw evidence of kidney renal damage amongst miners. And we will talk about this later on. So we do have environmental contamination, the exposure to miners, and the health harm to their health. Now, when we worked on these mines, where the reservoir mainly has to do with mercury, we were all told that there were other mines in the region, and they are here in yellow. There, aside from mercury, these had arsenic. So we went over to these mines to see what was happening. These are the other mines to find out for arsenic and mercury content. And this is the ore, crude ore from the deposit. And here we have the residue coming from these mines after the thermal treatment on the furnaces. And then on the right, we have the mine soil. Indeed, we did find high concentrations of mercury, but also of arsenic. This I'd say, completed the picture in terms of health risk. And this is a message for Minamat that we should not only look for mercury in these sites, but we can also look for other elements. When the remediation for mercury comes about, we can also get rid of these. Now, why were we so concerned about metal content in these mine residues? Why? Because these were used in the neighboring communities in order to fill in the holes on the streets, the potholes in the streets. Here we have a school where kids play, and this has arsenic and mercury. But even worse, on many of these households, the homes, we found that they have their own furnaces. So the effect we saw in the mines is also replicated in the households and in the yards because they would burn the ore. In this backyard, for example, we found within the home, that's the house, somebody lives there, and inside we found mercury and arsenic contamination. If there was so much mercury and arsenic in the mines, it is expected that the underground waters would also be contaminated and that we would find both elements. Indeed, in some of the samples we found mercury, and in all of them we found arsenic at levels way above permitted. So mercury and arsenic contamination in the water, in the soil, in the mines. We went over then to look at the open communities. These are small communities. Do not be frightened by these low ends because these were studies whereby the population have the right to participate, to be engaged. Children, women. In these groups, we found both arsenic as well as mercury. This is already an environmental uh, situation. We're not talking about children who work on the mines. These are not women that work in the mines. We're talking about groups of people who live close to the mining operation. And this is a San Gaspar community, and this is another place. That in terms of humans. Now, just look at the beautiful scenery because this is a biosphere reserve. The mines are located within the biosphere reserve. And you can see here the terrible situation of the mines, but the surrounding landscape is beautiful. We went over then to study the biota, and we did find mercury and arsenic content in the streams in this area. There was sediment located there. We found mercury in the leaves of trees. At the highest levels possible. Please take a look at the reference site, and there was a home that had a furnace in the back yard. And what was happening in one of the mines? So we took leaves from the trees here in the surrounding area of the mine. And in all situations, the levels were above those in the reference site. We have a limit of reference of 3, and we found values way above, even above 300. So the volatile mercury is indeed absorbed by the trees through their leaves. And this brings mercury into the biota chain, into the habitats. We were able to take a look at the rodents, to rats, and these rats that were caught in the mine had in the liver mercury content above what was found in the rats caught in the reference site. So the rats were also exposed to mercury. Our surprise was when we took a look at the kidneys of these rats. The values were very, very high. Let us remember that the kidney is a white is a target for this kind of substance. So we did find mercury in biota, not only the rats, but also in worms. The worms that were caught in the mines, in the area around the mine, had levels of way above reference site. We finally took a look at the insects. These are results with bees. And please remember that bees feed on flowers. And if mercury is uh, found in the plants, then that would have been a good route to affect the bees. And indeed, the bees that were caught in the area of the mine showed values and levels above those of the bees caught in reference site. So we do indeed have an issue of environmental contamination, and exposure at occupational levels amongst the miners, and contamination and exposure in the biota, as well as in the vulnerable, sensitive population, such as the children who live in surrounding areas. This is the very complicated situation that we find in the artisan mining operations in Mexico. We have made educational programs so that the children may be warned that they cannot eat or play in these polluted areas. We have worked with the miners, with the community. We have explained the risks involved in mercury. We submitted the results to Minamata Mexico Group. And this was quite an accomplishment on our side. We are very, very satisfied that this information, that this data was used by Mexico, that this information was considered by UN Environment Division, and that we now have a GEF program in the area that is fully devoted to finding options for these miners. We want these mines to be closed, as stated by Minamata. But aside from closing them, we must do remediation. Now, what is the problem? The problem is that these are the sites we have studied. All of these red dots are places for historic mining sites with abandoned sites with the presence of mercury. So it's no easy task. It's a large area that is very contaminated by mercury. And here we have the exposure to human beings and to biota. What do we need to do? We have to look at the distribution of mercury throughout the area. We must continue analyzing the effects in populations that are exposed through some kind of a route to mercury. It is very much distributed in the whole area. And finally, one of the questions that most concern us is the possible presence of methyl mercury. Remember, this is a historical site. It's a site with soil rich in microorganisms. That means that we must respond to the question on the possible presence of methyl mercury. This is my presentation. I leave here my contact in case you need more information of studies being conducted in the area. And I am very grateful for the organizers for the invitation to bring here and share this information.
Thank you very much, Fernando. And yeah, this is a very horrifying situation with the all the occupational exposure and the exposure to residents. But since this is a session on the contaminated land, it is I appreciate that you mentioned the contaminated land issues that in the latter part of your presentation. Now we have 5 minutes for discussion, and I don't see any question in the chat box. So I think I have uh, uh, I have the uh, some two questions. One to the colleagues from the Valais canton, which is I understand the Swiss or canton regulation on contaminated land, but if this kind of in the Mexican case that this is an informal activity and past uh, uh, contamination, the historical activities, and we are not sure who uh, uh, needs to pay. So, in Swiss regulation, do you have any provisions for this kind of contamination where cost recovery is very difficult? And my question to to Fernando is that in terms of the contaminated land, since this is a mercury mining site, of course the soil and rocks contain mercury, perhaps in syllabus, HGS, and it could be it, perhaps it should be separated from the issue of the contamination with the elemental mercury, or as you said, if there's any methyl mercury, it is indeed a problem. So, do you see any uh, uh, plan for uh, looking at the assessing the risk of the contaminated land? Uh, uh, Perhaps the distinguishing between the HGS and the elemental mercury. So, can I turn to any of either Chantal or Stefan?
Yeah. um, so in cases where the polluter is not there anymore, then basically it's the collectivity who has to take the costs with the help of the federal government. Um, but yeah, one of the main thing of the first step is really to find to do a historical study to really find what happened there and try to find as many information as possible to really identify the various polluters that were implied in the contaminated site that you're investigating. But of course, if the polluter is not there anymore, then it's it's the collectivity that is paying for all the studies and in remediation that has to be done.
Thank you, thank you. I think that is really a challenge for the countries.
Mm.
And to Fernando, I see some question in the chat in Spanish. I don't think I understand. So
let,
if
let
if
me
you
let
yeah
me read it.
yeah so if you can just 1 minute so address my question or the question in the chat, it would be great.
Well, there are some questions. The first is how do we define the reference zone in our study? I'm going to answer that in Spanish. See,
The first thing that we did was environmental assessment in order to ensure that there was no mercury in the area. And that was very, very important and quite clearly far from the site. But let me say that all of the environmental samples taken in the contaminated sites were of the same type of those taken in the reference site. So aside from being free of mercury, they had to be in a similar habitat for the biota. The second question: is there any open project for remediation of mercury contaminated sites? Well, that's the $100 million question. Indeed, there is economic resource, there are funds devoted to assess the needs for remediation in the area. A risk assessment is going to be conducted having in mind the type of mercury, whether it's a methyl, organic, or whatever, and what is the kind of the distribution in the environment. Thus, we will be able to see the extension of the contamination. And there are many ideas about the remediation, especially having in mind that the federal government. Now, what are the reference values used for the comparison with the biota? That is why we had a reference site. Why? Because it's very difficult to find in literature reference values for the precise, specific species that were found in our own biota. There is a food monitoring. Yes, fortunately, in the area, this is not an agricultural area, it's a mining area. The agricultural fields are farther off and they are mercury free. There are no fish in this area. Is there any link? Well, I left you my email uh, in here. For the organizers, I can pass on the publications. I can share them with the organizers, and these are my answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. So the presentations and relevant information will be posted on the convention website. Thank you very much, and I'm 2 minutes over, but I like to close this session one. Thank you very much to the presenters, and I hand it over to Christiane, who is going to lead the session two.
Thank you, Isaku. I see there is a last question for Chantal. Perhaps can Chantal direct give the answer in the chat. We are
Sí,
going.
es,
We are. Sorry.
es que se refieren a tener la...
You're talking about the presentation?
They want to have the presentation.
Sorry, I had a little problem with the translation. Now we are going to move on to session 2, which is focused on remediation. First, Guido van den de Kotterle and Matt Boeknecht from TAU, Netherlands, will present us the state of the art of the management of mercury contamination and waste at chlor-alkali sites. Please, Guido and Matt.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I will share my screen. Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you. I will give a presentation on managing mercury contamination and waste at a chloralkali site. My name is Guido van der Kootlet from TAU. My colleague Matthijs Bouknecht is also in the meeting, and he's also ready to answer any questions if needed. Let me go to the next slide. So firstly, about ourselves, TAU and Mercury. TAU is Dutch engineering firm with a strong focus on the industrial clients, with about 1,200 staff in the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, France, Spain, and Italy. And we work on the dismantling of mercury cell chloralkali sites in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Spain, and France for industrial clients. In addition, we work internationally for UNEP, UNIDO, World Bank on contaminated sites, and also a lot on persistent organic pollutants in various countries. In recent years, we've supported our industrial clients with the decommissioning of their chloralkali facilities, and we really are also using that to help the international community. Myself, I'm as I mentioned, I'm Guido van der Kotlet, and I'm an international project manager. Now, I'm going to talk about the whole process. I'm going to talk about how the demolition of these chloralkali facilities, how we tackle that in practice, and I will also bring to the attention some of the soil remediation that is really part of it, because we do see this as an integrated process. Based on our experience, it's quite difficult to separate one from the other. Of course, you can try, but you'll end up with a lot of unexpected surprises, and usually not in the good way. So what we normally do for a site like this is we really start with a diagnosis of the site itself through desktop studies and site assessment. These are really actions focused on an inventory of what is present on the site, and then we're looking both at the building materials as well as the soil and groundwater, and even in the surroundings of the site. After the decommissioning itself, that is a controlled process, and the soil and groundwater remediation and aftercare, which is something that usually comes after. Now, what type of sites do we encounter in our work? It's basically, if I'm looking at chloralkali facilities, we have three types. One is really the chemical site that is still in operation. It requires a very detailed assessment, and it is really, you want to limit the impact of the activities on the other processes that are still going on site. Some other sites are sites that are still closed but are still managed. What we have seen in Europe, that some of the old Mercury cell facilities, they have been simply closed, but they have been kept to a certain level. I wouldn't say operational, but at least from complete collapse. They are much easier to access, but there is a strong focus on future reuse of these areas. And the last one is really the one that you see on the right. Unfortunately, there is a lot of them that are completely abandoned. They are there, they're left to, deteriorate. They're in ruins, and the situation gets more and more complicated because the buildings are on the verge of collapse. The assessment gets more critical, but also there's, in many cases, nobody to take care of them anymore. Now, how do we start with the whole process of a site like this? Well, first we start with desktop studies and site assessment. Now, we do that firstly, that we really want to quantify the materials. So we use an XRF technology to establish mercury concentrations in all the building materials of the site. You see some pictures of that. Now, for those of you who have worked with XRF, it has its limitations as well. So it's not like you put the XRF everywhere and it's going to be exactly what you want. You need to make sure that either your XRF software is sufficient and can measure mercury in sufficiently low concentrations. You really have to make sure that there is a high quality data assessment. We also use mercury vapor analyzers to make sure that our staff is protected during their operations. Essentially, I saw the Swiss quantities. For a site, we would do around 500 samples and analysis, and that is really laboratory sampling and analysis. XRF readings, they can be done on the site, and we can do many, many more. Sometimes we also do small scale testing if separation can be made along contamination levels. So you really want to make sure that you can reduce the quantity of waste that are going to be generated during the future cleanup of these sites. next slide. Afterwards, what is one of the things that we do is we do a full-scale 3D modeling of the locations. So that is a combination of drone mapping and inside 3D modeling in order to assess to the greatest detail the total quantity of building materials that you will get out of these sites. And we have to find, of course, a compromise between the number of samples and the detail of our investigation, and future uncertainty. So let's say if we spend a lot of money inventorying very detailed parts of these facilities, it doesn't really weigh up against the extra costs you will have at the other end. So there is a balance that we need to find. Now, from our experience, where do you find the mercury? I've just made a brief sketch of a facility, and what we have seen in our sites is that the floors of these mercury cell facilities, they can contain mercury concentrations up to 80,000 milligrams per kilogram. That is super high, and the floors are heavy because they used to had to hold the big mercury cells, so they're thick. They can be to a certain level saturated with mercury, so they're definitely a problem. When you look up the walls, if we check those with XRF, we find concentrations up to 5,000 milligrams per kilogram in the walls. And actually, the higher you get in the building, the higher the concentrations are, especially in warmer climates. The mercury will evaporate and it will be in the walls. We also see it in the roofs of the buildings. Many times they are made of asbestos, so we get a double problem where we have asbestos mixed with mercury. Another thing that's very common is brine sludges that have been illegally disposed, easily 5,000 milligrams per kilogram or 500, but sometimes even more. I think also, once again, from the Swiss example, you saw that sometimes the mercury is not where you think it is. In one case, somebody might have disposed it in a brine pond, or there was a discharge channel, and people start to move the sediments around and they start to spread it. So it's really it's very similar to what we have experienced. It's not always, you not always find the mercury where you think it is. Another thing that we found in a lot of the sites is that we've done really detailed investigations, and then we take off the building itself, and all of a sudden we find the mercury in different locations, different concentrations. So the presence in the soil is very heterogenic. You see some of the pictures here on the right side. We take off some of the flooring, and we can actually see the elementary mercury all around it. But if we would have drilled, in between, it would have looked like this sample would be, I wouldn't say clean necessarily, but the concentrations would be nowhere near what you would find if you'd actually scoop this whole part. So there's clearly a very irregular spread of the mercury contamination in the soil. This site, concentrations of up to 1,200 milligrams per kilogram. We are just busy in the Balkans. We find over 7,000 milligrams per kilogram also in the topsoil in more or less unsuspected areas. So it's really heterogenic, and it's not easy to really delineate, especially not when the buildings are still there. Groundwater, a lot of the groundwater in these sites is also contaminated with mercury, but one of the biggest issues is that it's a mix with other pollutants. We don't just find mercury, we find chlorinated hydrocarbons, you'll find oil, you'll find sometimes chlorobenzenes if you're looking at pesticide production facilities. So yeah, the groundwater tends to be a huge mix. Now, if from a site like this, your average chloralkali mercury cell facility, our estimates is that there is up to 5 tons of mercury still left in the walls and maybe even in the roof. In the floors, you are looking at anywhere between 10 and dozens of tons of mercury, because the concentrations can be really high. So it's easily assuming that every single chloralkali facility will still contain somewhere between 20 and 30 tons of mercury, just in the building itself, the floors, and the soil underneath it. Now, decommissioning, this will be short. Initial phase, when you do the decommissioning of these sites, you really need to make a preliminary design for your cost estimate. However, what we have found out time and time again is that there is a flexibility required. A separation into waste streams with unit prices will assist, but you will encounter things that you didn't expect. You take away, the concrete slabs, and you'll find pure mercury, or you'll find, a much more contaminated material. So yeah, you have to make sure that you are flexible in what you do in this phase. Now, what we also you also want to separate your materials as much as possible between metals and steel, hazardous waste with mercury requiring stabilization, other waste where stabilization is not feasible, and of course, if you find metallic mercury, you need to stabilize it as mercury sulfide. Now, there is a short section on what kind of challenges you fight, and one of them is really the state of the buildings. They're very old, degraded conditions. So if you want to work there, or if you need to drill there, they are on the verge of collapse in some of the cases. But you find really a mixture of pollutants, mercury, PCB, dioxins, asbestos. So you have to take everything into account, both for the building materials as well as when you start to look at the soil and groundwater contamination. These are complex operations, and you have to meet safety constraints of course, the client and your own company. You have to take care of your other site operation and health and safety, both on and off site. When we do the commissioning, or when we support our clients in the decommissioning, we really do daily work preparation, daily shared knowledges, and we daily check the wastes, where it's going, what are the quantities, how do we anticipate for changes. And we do see the importance of a second characterization during demolition works to optimize, when possible, the waste routes. Now, so let's say we're done with the building. We go towards the soil and groundwater. I think that's of interest to many of you. So where is the mercury? If we look at the site that we have just described, where is the mercury if we look at it in a cross section? So what we see is we have mercury in sludge ponds, but it can be also a drainage channel. Some mercury that has been sent off-site, and that was a lot of time it was the wastewater or production sludges. They can be traced reasonably easy. However, when it goes deeper into the ground, we tend to get into trouble. What happens, especially with high concentrations of mercury, it can start to behave like a dense non-aquatic layer, a DNAPL, and that will start to spread, and it will just go deeper and deeper underground, only until it actually finds a layer that doesn't let it through, and that can be, for instance, a clay layer, but it can also be bedrock. However, if you have fractured bedrock, the mercury can enter into the fractured bedrock, and I'm talking about the elementary mercury in this case, and it will continue to form plumes. So you can try and clean the water on top of it, but if you have elementary mercury in DNAPLs in any place, they will continue to pollute the groundwater, And yeah, that is something that you have to take into account when you start investigating a site. So how to investigate a site for mercury? And I'm talking about, of course, soil and groundwater. Well, I mean, the brine and the sludge ponds, but also the channel, I guess, as an example that we heard in Switzerland. You do that. We do that with manual drilling and control with XRF. Now, the XRF has as an issue that your lower limit, the ones that we have are anywhere between 3 and 7 ppm. So you really are already above your risk threshold levels. On the other hand, the XRF, it's fast and it's a good way to trace your source areas. So you do find it, then you really start to map further using regular sampling and laboratory analysis. In building areas with foundations, there's really an erratic pattern of mercury. So it's, it's a hit and miss if you would actually drill through a floor. So the use of vapor pins is something that can establish the presence of mercury in soil vapor, especially if you have soil that is sandy or there is it has a bit more permeability. So it will give you a rough estimate or a, a rough picture of where the mercury can be in the soil. Based on that, you can do your specific drilling and make an initial assessment. In groundwater, the selection of wells, both in shallow groundwater as well as till the base of the aquifer to track any denaples. And the data compiled, we'll put it in. We usually put it in 3D software to model location and quantity.
Guido, could you
Yes.
please try to complete your presentation in 3 minutes?
All right, I'll be quick.
Yeah, or
Thank you.
5 minutes. Thank you.
All right. So here you see some pictures how we do it. We have the field registration of the data. We combine that in the GIS. Afterwards, we'll go to 3D modeling, and then there is a design of the most polluted areas. For soil, the remediation options, and I will go to the next slide, are really that we've seen our solidification stabilization, we've looked at soil washing, we have thermal treatment, and we've got landfilling. There is always a balance that you need to find between the costs, of course, and the environment risks and safety. And this balance really also depends on the quantities you're looking at. The bigger your quantities, certain options might be better than others. And it also depends on the type of soil you have. For instance, for clay, soil washing is not really possible, and you might want to choose landfilling. So there is always a balance you need to find, and you need to figure out which is the best solution for you. For groundwater, the remediation options really are pump and treat, extracting the water, treating it before discharge. Hydraulic containment, it's really a longer term solution. Or in situ on-site metal precipitation. So in this case, the mercury in groundwater will form a stable precipitation of mercury sulfide. And that will ensure that the mercury concentrations will decrease in your groundwater, and that will be basically fixed to the soil, where in groundwater, of course, you're looking at micrograms per liter as hazard classes, where in soil, things are in milligrams per liter. So you'd be better off if you can make sure that the mercury in the groundwater is no longer soluble. So this is a picture of an installation of a injection well to precipitate mercury in groundwater. One last note I'd say before I'm closing my presentation is really beware mercury cycle. As we all know that mercury can change from metallic to salt form and time, and further through watersheds and sediments, and partly convert into organic mercury. And this is really what we want to try and avoid. And this is really for a lot of the sites a future liability when it comes to offsite sediments. Ecological risk assessment can facilitate finally decision making among stakeholders and set realistic goals, as we only have the ability to spend our money once, and as we can see, there is many problems, and unfortunately never enough budget. Last but not least, have a plan for the site. Make sure that you don't just remediate for the remediation, but think of what you want to do after, and that will allow you to be the most cost efficient with what you're doing. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and informative presentation. Questions and discussion will take place at the end of the session 2. So please write your questions in the chat. And I give now the floor to Stéphane Colombano from BRGM in France, who will present the state-of-the-art recommendations and future needs for the remediation of mercury-contaminated sites. Please, Stéphane.
Thanks, Christian. Hello, everybody. I will try to share my screen. Can you see my presentation now? I hope so.
Yes.
It's okay.
Perhaps full screen.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. This presentation is based on the work of other BRGM colleagues, that mean Daniel Hubé, Valérie Guérin, and Corinne Merly. We are all working BRGM. This is, let's say, the French Geological Survey. And the topics of our presentation is remediation of mercury-contaminated sites. What is the state of the art and the recommendation and the future needs? A few words for the introduction. The selection of the mercury remediation options mainly depends on the characteristic of the initial mercury contamination and its associated risk to human health and ecosystem. That means that this choice of remediation is strongly depending on the remediated mercury and non-remediated and remaining mercury. We've seen that there is a lot of different kind of speciation depending on the oxidation state and so on. And as we are speaking about metals, the remediation of mercury consists in non-destructive processes compared to organic compound. That means that we will only remove or stabilize mercury in order to make it safe for the environment and the surrounding potential human and ecological receptors. That means we have to assess the remediation based on understanding of the, let's say, of the behavior of the mercury. What are the species that we are to face with? Is it elemental mercury, two-valent mercury, and so on? And we have to understand in a very accurate way the fate and transport of this mercury, and specifically the remaining mercury, because it's hard to, as we will see, to remediate all the to take off or to stabilize all the mercury in the environment. We have to be sure that the remaining mercury will not be, let's say, a problem for the future decades. And we have to assess the human risk, human health risk, and the ecosystem after the remediation. As some other colleagues have said, mercury, when it's elemental mercury, when we are speaking with elemental mercury, its behavior is like DNAPL. That means dense non-aqueous phase liquids. That means it cannot, let's say, it's quite not soluble. But that means it's a free phase, and it will behave as a free phase, a very dense free phase, because the density is quite heavy, 13. And also, there is something different between the mercury and others, the NaPl, because the interfacial tension is very important. If I look on, let's say, tetrachloroethanes, the interfacial tension is about 60 millinewton per meters. With the mercury, it's more than 500. That means that to move that, it's tricky. And when mercury is present as a metals, it will behave as other metals with some precipitation, dissolution, complexation, and so on. That means it's something in between the NAPL and classical metals. And with the complexation of mercury, when we speak about complexation of mercury, there can be some bonds with organic matter as well as inorganic stuff. I'm thinking about, for example, oxide, hydroxide, and so on. Because mercury as an elemental, when it's elemental, it will behave as I told like denapel, and there will be a lot of droplets all around in the whole site, and it's quite complicated to evaluate the mass of mercury that is present in the soil. And if there is only a few bubbles or few ganglia that are staying in the soil, there will be some release, speaking about the aqueous phase or the gaseous phase. This is an illustration to show, it is a site in the French Alps to show how it's quite complicated to really see the hotspots and the most concentrated part of mercury in such polluted sites. You see here that the distribution of mercury under a former electrolysis cells, and you see that it's quite complicated to even to see what is the exact mass of that pollutant. When we have to elaborate a remediation plans, we have to think in our mind in four main principles. The first step is to have an accurate and complete site conceptual model. And we have to have a site-specific approach. Which quantity, which mass can be left in the soil of mercury can be left in the soil, and so on. The second step, we need a lot of lab scales experiment for preliminary treatability tests, because it's something tricky to work with these compounds. The third step is that we need also field scale, not only lab scale, but also field scale, to take into account the preliminary technico-economical feasibility study. And during the operation, we have to have in mind, as it was said before, that it can be complicated, for example, for the worker health, and we have to make some specific measurements in the environment and so on during the remediation process, the remediation operation. We have to, when we speak about mercury, we have to be as accurate as we can, speaking about vertical and horizontal distribution of mass and concentration of total mercury, but also with speciation of the mercury. Because depending on the pH and oxidation potential, and let's say the presence of other things, chlorine and so on, it can be transformed and switched from one speciation to another one. I mean that it's not too easy to see exactly what's happened in the soil. And just have a look, for example, on the effect of the characteristic of the soil on the mercury remediation process. On the table, you have the soil characteristic, pH, redox potential, organic matter, total organic carbon, particle size, presence of other compounds, and soil types. And you see the effect of these soil characteristics on the remediation technology that we can take into account. The solidification, stabilization, for example, soil washing, and thermal treatments. That means there's not generical stuff to generical remediation for mercury. It's really depending on the type of site. Is it permeable, not permeable? Is the pH very high or not? What is the particle size, and so on. And this is an example of this let's say this industrial plant in the Alps, and there was about 500 tons of mercury rich in gravels and sand, and the The remediation that was carried out was with, first of all, some treatability and technico-economical, based on treatability and technico-economical balance. We first excavate the soils. You can see some ganglia of the Mercury on the upper part of the upper and left part of the slide. And after we stabilize this Mercury with the addition of sulfur that do some synabri. And the cost is can reach 1,000 euro per ton. That means it's something quite important. If we speak about the elaboration of remediation plan, the first thing that we have to have in mind is it possible to excavate the soil or not? That means how deep is the pollution? Is it more than 5-10 meters? And if it's possible to excavate the soil, it's possible also to make some washing, to make some separation of the different size of the soil and make some washing before having some off-site landfill disposal or so on, or make on-site, for example, some separation with hydrometallurgical staff, with addition of, let's say, some washing staff or flocculation staff. When it's possible to excavate the soil. If it's not possible, there are two opportunities. There are two. The first one is to deal with in situ remediation, and there is some in situ thermal desorption that is currently done in France, and with some good remediation rate and yields. There are also some, let's say, pilot scale with chemical soil washing and immobilization, in situ chemical washing or in situ immobilization. And if we do not deal with in situ remediation, and if it's not possible to excavate the soil, we have to confine the soil. That means to make some confinement or with active or passive capping. The report was written by some colleagues in an European project. It was called IMAG. It was in Snowman Network. And some of the results I show you are based on this let's say, book. And there was a selection of the proven technology or emerging technology to remediate soil polluted by mercury. You have here one print screen of the result of this literature review. You have the technology, the principle, the key advantages and main disadvantages, the targeted mercury, and the status. Is it innovating? Is it proven or emerging technology? To make it short, the conclusion of this report is that if we speak about soil remediation technology with or without excavation, the proven technology are based on physical separation and soil washing. Physical separation based on granulometric separation, dry separation or wet separation, and soil washing if it's needed. The thermal treatment also is speaking about ex situ thermal desorption is something that is proven and also efficient. It's very expensive, but it's quite efficient. The immobilization technology are also proven. I'm speaking about stabilization, adding of sulfur, or let's say a nanoparticle of tin or zinc and so on, but amalgamation, for example. And the containment, in situ isolation and containment. And also the excavation and off or on-site disposal. If we speak about emerging technology that are quite new in the lab, but are coming slow, let's say more and more on the pilot scale, there are some electrokinetic technology, some phytoremediation, when the site has a very huge area, and when it's not, the pollution is not too important. There are also some in situ thermal treatments and other technology based on nano microtechnology, soil flushing, and so on. Let's speak now about water remediation technology. The most used are pump and treat with a wastewater treatment plant and permeable reactive barriers. And the emerging technology are based on the wastewater treatment plant, mainly. It's based on amalgamation, pump and stripping, some adsorption based on nanotechnology or microtechnology, some flocculation and bioremediation. You have here, there was a questionnaire that was sent to different stakeholders in Europe, and you have here the current practices for mercury contaminated soil remediation on the left part, and the groundwater remediation on the right part. And if you have a look, the technology that are most used is stabilization on site and excavation and landfill off-site for soil remediation. And if we speak about groundwater remediation, the permeable reactive barriers, hydraulic containment, as well as oxide reduction of the groundwater are the most remediation technology used. Speaking about recommendation and conclusion, yeah, we have to think about the protection of workers' health, and there are some lot of organizational constraints and additional cost for all this protection. There's not, most of the time we are not speaking about one technology, but technology train is often required. And the soil remediation technology, we have spoken about a few technology, but as I told you, there's only a few technology up to now that are applied. Many in Europe, excavation and on-site treatment of the soil, excavation and immobilization, and in-situ containment. We do think that there is some needs to have some innovative in-situ technology, for example, what is not possible to excavate when the pollution depth is very important. There is some, let's say, some innovative research to do with that. There are some barriers that avoid this technology to be implemented. New technology, for example, there are some uncertainties on efficiency of this technology. We are speaking about environmental technology verification. When it's new, it's sometimes scaring, let's say, and we have to be more safer. And when we, for example, if we speak about in situ stabilization, we have to have more, let's say, safe things with the duration of the pollution and so on. There is also a lot of lack of knowledge in the effect of the implementation on the environment, and mainly this new technology, speaking about in situ stabilization, in situ the emerging technology I was speaking a few slides back, it's mainly some pilot scale and in the lab. We have to increase, in our opinion, the other research needs is it might that, for example, we have to also improve the treatment of high rate polluted air, high rate. We have to improve the treatment of polluted air when we deal with some adsorption, with some adsorption, for example. The adsorption rate is not so important. We have to find new adsorption stuff in order to work with very high flow rates, air flow rates. We have also to find new to increase the absorption and the filtration capacity for the pump and treatment technology, because sometimes we have to deal with several hundreds cubic meter per hours, and we have to find something that new adsorbent and safer adsorbent for this kind of polluted site. There's also a lot of research need when we speak about chloralkali sites, because we are dealing with groundwater with under high pH, high ionic strength, sometimes also with other contaminants, with chlorine and so on, that increase the solubility of the mercury. And we think that we need some tools to assess this new technology and to make some, let's say, environmental technology verification to help to deal with this mercury pollution. And the last but not the least, when we speak about mercury, we are always speaking about speciation. And we do think that geological modeling can help to not only to choose the right remediation, but also for the assessment and also for the, let's say, the characterization, the assessment of the site, and for the remediation. But we think that some geological modeling can be helpful during all the characterization and remediation process. Thanks for your attention. And if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this very informative overview of all these remediation technologies. There is a questions in the chat. Which is your opinion on using phytoremediation to clean site polluted with mercury? Is it an efficient technology?
Oh, in my opinion, when the phytoremediation we see in the literature review and some little pilot that phytoremediation is working when the concentration is not too important, first of all, and also when the pollution is not is depending also of the roof of the plant. That means the pollution must not be too deep. These two stuff, and also when we have time, because phytoremediation takes times. And let's say it can be helpful. Up to now, it's mainly labs experiments, but it could be helpful when the site is surface area is very huge. The concentration is not so important. The remediation rates and yield are not so important. In this case, there can be some opportunity to use phytoremediation.
Thank you very much. There is also a question for Guido, and Stefan can also react on these questions. The question is ask why on-site remediation technologies such as thermal desorptions was considered as non-viable option in the with a lot of red marks. And if you have considered a combination of soil washing and thermal desorption treatment.
Yes, I'm just checking my camera is not working, but can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, and the camera.
Yeah, my camera is going. Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. I think every site you need to make a new assessment, and in the case of the assessment that we did for a specific site, and I didn't mention that during my presentation. We had to look at this technology, and there was some issues that made a combination of soil washing and thermal treatment not very suitable. One of them, I think the soil was very clayey, and secondly, we had at the same site also a problem with persistent organic pollutants. So yeah, that was something that made a thermal absorption simply not suitable for this location. Of course, the costs were also much higher than for some of the other options. So it really, my message is it really depends on the type of site you have, the type of soil you have, and also, for instance, other contaminants. So I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. We are on time. Perhaps a last question for Stefan, if it's possible to share the remediation guide.
For sure. It's
Okay.
public report for sure. I will.
We can put also on the site of Minamata Secretary. And we are right on time for the conclusion. Perhaps from my side, a last questions for you, boss. Which of the innovative remediation methods to be developed do you think are the most promising from a sustainability point of view? Very not easy. I know we have to do a case-to-case study, but yes, from your point of view. Stefan, if you have a...
Let's say the most, it's we're speaking about green remediation. It's quite complicated because let's say the most efficient, not speaking case to case, but the most efficient is for sure thermal desorption. But it's the energy consumption is quite important, and but if there is a feedback with, for example, not mercury thermal desorption, but let's say chlorinated thermal desorptions, it's proven in some case that when you deal with thermal desorption, the total amounts of energy you have to consume is smaller. For example, if you compare a very important energy consumption in 4-5 months compared to pump and trade with 1 decade. And sometimes you can balance the both. That means the thermal consumption is not so beneficial for pump and trade and for thermal desorption. And it can be something. And after it's I think also that the in situ remediation, if we can overpass the classical in situ remediation the problems, can be something efficient. Also, when it's deep with in situ stabilization and so on. But it's quite complicated to speak about, let's say, green remediation in a generic case. It's not so easy to answer that. Especially with mercury, that is metals.
But thank you very much for your input on thermal desorption. So now it's time for the conclusion and for the follow-up. Thanks again to all the speakers, and I give the floor to Pedro.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Christine. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Says the speaker. Yes, we can hear you perfectly. Okay, thank you very much. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Pedro Sendis. I'm a specialist in environment in Peru, and I work with them in the management and preservation. So first of all, I'd like to thank Janel Inkov, Stefan Westermann, Fernando Diaz, and Van der Kotlet, and Stefan Colombano for everything they've contributed to this webinar. I'd like to thank the Swiss government for funding this event. Today's webinar is the first event of a number that we're going to have between the regulators and the Common Forum and the Secretariat of Dinamata in order to discuss the management of polluted areas polluted with mercury, and the implementation of the Minamata Agreement. Now, as part of this cooperation agreement, we've been very well received by member countries in the region, and they've told us what areas of interest are going to be discussed. So we're going to have regulators from countries in Latin America, 9 countries, and they expressed 6 areas of interest that include strategies and technologies for cleaning mercury polluted sites, strategies and technologies for characterizing mercury polluted areas, aspects related to health in relation to mercury pollution, strategies and technologies for the remediation of mercury polluted areas, the management of mercury in waste, and the implementation of the Minamap Agreement. Now, today's webinar has covered 3 of these areas of interest. We've had a number of 2 presentations on risk assessment in mercury polluted sites. One of them relates to Switzerland on strategies for risk assessment, and in mercury polluted soils and in mountains. And also, there was a discussion in Mexico for risk assessment for health for people in locations of mercury mining. We've also had 2 presentations on remediation of mercury polluted sites. Firstly, on current technologies in Europe and remediation of residues. And secondly, on the state of the art and recommendations for rehabilitating sites polluted by mercury. In 2023, we hope to develop further activities on these 6 proposed themes for managing mercury contaminated sites in Latin America. And we would like you to contact anyone who is interested in sharing their experiences. If they have done any case studies or projects on the management of mercury contaminated sites. So thank you very much for participating. And I hope that we will see you very soon in another event. I now give the floor to the Secretariat of DINAMAC. Isako, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I think we have 4 minutes for the further closing remarks. So I'm turning to whether uh, Dietmar or Christiane wants to want to say a few words, but from the secretary, Minamata Secretariat, sincere thanks to all the speakers, and we will definitely post the presentations and recording on the website that is that I chat indicated in the chat, and the authors speakers are free to add any links to useful documents, and I look forward to the future sessions. Christiane, do you want to say something?
Thank you to all the speakers and the attenders of this webinar. I hope it was interesting for everybody, and I really hope that we will have the opportunity to exchange on these very important topics in the future. Thank you, and have a peaceful end of the year.
Thank you. I don't see Dietmar, so I think we are happy to close this session. Warm regards from me too. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye bye.